In this demo, we'll inject a logger into the points of interest controller we previously created. The logger is a built-in service, so we don't have to register it on the container in our program class. We do potentially have to configure logging providers. A logging provider is a service that stores or displays logs. You could, for example, configure a logging provider that displays logs to the console output window, stores logs in a file, or stores logs on Azure. What we're looking at right now is the program class. As you remember from the beginning of the course, this is where the host is set up by calling into create builder. This call, behind the scenes, calls into create default builder, and that registers different logging providers for us. As ASP.NET Core is open source, we can have a look at that. What we see here is the create default builder method. If we scroll down a bit, we see logging being configured. Providers for logging to the console window, logging to the debug window, and so on are added. We also see that the logging section from our configuration file is used to further configure logging in general. The default configuration file taken into account is our app settings file, scoped to the environment we're currently working in. In our case, that's development. So let's open the appsettings.development.json file. There's more info coming on scoping configuration to environments later on in this module when we tackle configuration files. For now, just know that for our current environment, it's the development configuration file that will be picked up. We can see that the default log level is information, meaning things with that level or higher will be logged. For category Microsoft.ASP.NET Core, which means each category that starts with Microsoft.ASP.NET Core, the level needs to be warning or higher for a message to be logged. Like this, levels and more can be configured. For our current demo, we will leave everything at its default values. Now we need to effectively log something. Let's open our points of interest controller. Here we can use constructor injection to inject an iLogger of T. T being the points of interest controller. Let's name it logger. And let's assign it to a private read-only _logger field. One thing left to do, adding a null check. This is something I tend to do by default. If you're using ASP.NET Core's built-in container, this check seems to be a bit redundant. We will not even get to the point where the null check has to happen, because we will already error out when trying to inject the logger in the first place. However, know that in ASP.NET Core the container can be replaced by any other container you want to use. And some of those might effectively return a null value if the type you're trying to inject isn't found. Therefore, in my opinion, it is still a good idea to add this null check. Constructor injection, which is what we're using here, is the preferred way of requesting dependencies. But for those cases where that's not feasible, you can always request a service from the container directly. You can do that via HTTP context.request services. On that you will find methods like getService to resolve a service. Yet, as said, it is advised to use constructor injection when possible, so we will stick to that. Then, let's effectively log something. If we scroll down a bit, we've got our action that returns the points of interest for a city. If the city isn't found, we return a not found. Let's say that we want to log this fact. For that we use the logger we injected. On this logger we can find a set of methods that allow us to log messages depending on the severity level. Logging levels, in order of severity, are trace, debug, information, warning, error, and critical. We're going to use the log information method for our demo. So we call into log information, and then we pass through a message. The message we're gonna log is that the city with the pass-through city ID wasn't found when trying to access its points of interest. Alright, let's give this a try. I switched to Postman and I got a request lined up here from a previous demo, in which we tried getting the points of interest for a city that doesn't exist. Let's send that request. We get back a 404 not found as expected. This time we also expect something to be logged. Let's switch to the console output window. As we remember, that was one of the logging providers that was registered. And indeed, we now see our message. We also see other messages being logged. This is logging output from the framework services themselves. The reason that our message shows up at all is because the default log level in the development environment configuration file is information or higher. Let's set this to warning. And let's give that another try. We're back in Postman. Let's send our request again. We get back a 404 not found, as expected. And if all went well, our message should not show up anymore. And that is indeed the case. In fact, we don't see any messages anymore. That's because all of those messages we previously saw were logged with log level information. To ensure that our message shows up again, we can again change the default level. But we can also add more specific configuration for our controller class. The category name when logging is automatically set to the type name. In our case, that's cityinfo.api.controllers.points-of-interest-controller. What we can do is add a specific log level for this type or maybe for all controllers. We do that by setting the category to the namespace our controllers live in, cityinfo.api.controllers, and we set the log level to information. Let's give this another try. We send our request again, and we switch back to the console window. And there we go, here's our message again. The other messages from the framework services still don't show up because the default log level is still set to warning. Like this, you can be very granular in regards to how logging is set up. I'm going to set the default level back to information. I kinda like these messages showing up as I have a tendency to forget the port the API is running on. In that case, it's kinda nice to be able to read it from the console window. If you want, you can also configure the logging providers themselves manually instead of relying on the create default builder code. Let's open the program class again. The create builder method here automatically configures a set of logging providers, and we can extend and/or change these. For that, we call into builder.logging. This gives us access to the logging builder. On that, logging, including the providers, was configured in the create default builder code. We can find methods like add debug, add console, and so on to add providers. What we also find is a clear providers method. By calling into this, all the configured providers should be cleared, resulting in nothing being logged anymore. Let's try that. Let's send our request again. And let's have a look at the console window. And indeed, nothing is logged anymore. Now, let's manually add a console logger. For that, we call into builder.logging.addConsole. And let's give that another try. Let's send the request again. Here's our 404 not found. And there we go. All our messages are logged to the console output window again. This, combined with the configuration file, gives you quite a lot of flexibility in regards to what is logged how. Let's continue with logging exceptions.